So I'm hoping everybody has a handout, and folks at home have the handout, because that is our roadmap for today. We need to move fairly quickly. So I'm calling this thing a flying review because we cannot go into any tremendous depth about any one of these things. We have 18 topics to get through in the next 6 weeks. I've adapted this for what I typically do, and I think I did it with you at Ivy Tech. I've adapted that now for an audience of people who actually are practicing or are ready to practice, right? So we have a lot to get through. We can think about this as sort of getting started 2.0, and some of these topics you will have heard about when you did getting started, but we're going to go into a little more depth, starting with the very early stuff, going all the way through by the end to things that are particular to the Soto Zen denomination and to Sanshin as a Dharma family. My hope is we get to the point where we're sort of starting to answer the question, why does our practice here look like this? For me, that's always been a burning question. Why do we do what we do in this way? Buddhism is like this, and Soto Zen and Sanshin, right? So like, how do we make sense of that thing? So these 18 topics should point us in the direction, but I have to say right now, if there's anything here that intrigues you, that you want to know more about, please go read about it. Do some homework, dig into it. We can't go fully down to the bottom in this very short time. There will be lots of things you may want to follow up on. I also tried, given the diversity of experience here, I also tried to make sure that when we may be talking about really basic stuff, everyone probably knows what the Four Noble Truths are, everyone probably knows what the three treasures are. And if not, that's fine. Here's where you start. If you have some experience, there should also be some stuff at this level that you can chew on, right? So you'll notice on the handout, for instance, there's a set of questions for more advanced study and reflection at the bottom. I'm not going to talk about these because there isn't time. You might want to read them first, keep them in your mind as we're having a discussion today. As you're thinking about this over the course of the week, maybe you do a little reading around, maybe you give yourself a writing assignment, maybe you talk this over with your Sangha friends if you're somewhere else, for instance, if you want to kind of chew on this stuff at a higher level. So there should be something here for everybody, right? Enough about that, I think. Initial questions before we dive in.
Gene. I have a comment.
Okay.
One of the things, and I've had, excuse me, one of the things I've been doing, I've been studying more in depth to kind of fill a lot of gaps. And the surprising thing about this is if you think about, the Torah, the Bible, all these other books for religions, there are about 1 million words. So there's one place you can go. Mm-hmm. The thing that just blew me away is that Tibetan canons alone are 76 million words.
Yes.
So you got to think of this as a library.
Yes.
You will never learn. No. Well, if we go through 23 lives, we might.
Yes.
But you still may never learn everything there is to learn.
No, and of course even these,
about the practice.
And of course even these most basic fundamental terms mean something different depending on what sect, what time, what country, what culture, right? So this is why I'm saying there's no way in 6 weeks for an hour a week you can really thoroughly take these things in. My point in this is simply to point out these are 18 things you should probably have heard of, and now you can spend the rest of your practice life wrestling with that, getting to the bottom of that, like figuring out how the pieces fit. Okay, probably enough about that. So here in week 1, I want to hit 3 main things. Who is the Buddha? And we'll talk about the 3 treasures, Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, and the main branches of Buddhism. And that's going to take us probably past 8 o'clock. So who was the Buddha? Probably we all have some sense of the life of the Buddha. Nonetheless, it's good to probably review the main points. So human being, named Siddhartha Gautama, born we think something like 563 BCE in India, northern India, what is now Nepal, right? He was born into a particular socioeconomic situation in that he was the son of the ruler of a small kingdom there in India. So when he's born, his parents receive this prediction. This boy is either going to grow up to be a great king or a great religious leader. The father, of course, says, well, I would rather my son become a great king and succeed me and take over the kingdom, right? So he tries to keep this boy at home by giving him everything he would ever want. So this boy leads a very luxurious life. He has everything any child would ever want. Somehow, though, he escapes the palace 4 times. He goes out, he decides he wants to see the world. We know that he sneaks out with his attendant, and he sees an old person, and he sees a sick person, and he sees a dead person, and he is upset by this suffering because he has never encountered suffering. His father has shielded him from this in order to keep him from turning to some kind of ascetic or religious practice. The 4th time he goes out, he sees a religious person. He sees a mendicant or somebody who's made religious vows, and he says, I want to do that too because I'm interested in suffering, in the nature of suffering, and I want to liberate people from suffering, right? Aging, sickness, death. So we also know somewhere in the traditional stories about the Buddha's life, as a child, he's sitting watching a planting festival. This festival going on. They're planting rice, and during that, he sees a bird come and eat a worm that's been turned up in the soil. And he's upset by this because clearly there's suffering, there's death, right? He realizes that this is similar, this kind of situation is similar to what's happening with the small tribes around him that are being invaded and conquered because, of course, right, he comes from a ruling family, political family, if you will. So he sees his father dealing with this. This is what's going on around him. There are many small tribes. There is no one monumental thing called India at this point, right? There are many small tribes. And he sees this bird coming to eat this worm is just like these, one tribe comes and invades and conquers and takes over and eats the next one. He says, if I succeed my father and that becomes my life path, I'm going to inherit that conflict. I'm going to inherit that situation that doesn't feel okay to me. So instead, despite his father's best efforts, in the end, right, he becomes a religious person, leaves his palace, looks for a teacher, tries many, many kinds of practice, and we know there's a whole story around that. So, although he trains with a variety of teachers, none of those practices somehow satisfies his most basic questions, his most basic, he's still concerned about suffering. He says, so there's something about human life which has the characteristic of suffering. So he keeps leaving these teachers, right? He gets as good at each of these practices as the teacher, and the tradition says every time the teacher says, oh, please stay and teach with me, you're now as good as I am. He says, no, I have questions. And I haven't got to the answer yet. I haven't got to the bottom yet. So he goes and tries something else, right? Finally, he sits down by himself under a tree, and this is the story we hear at Rohatsu every year, right? He sits down by himself and he says, I'm not getting up until I understand the nature of suffering. So under the Bodhi tree, he finally attains awakening. Now we start to call him Shakyamuni Buddha. Before there's a human being sitting there, he has this awakening experience. Now we have Buddha, right? Because Buddha is about awakening. So he understands some basic things, which we are going to be talking about. After a while, he gets up from this tree. He's had a long conversation with himself in which he says, I really would like to teach this to people, but it's too profound, it's too deep, nobody but me will ever understand. So tradition says he has visitations from heavenly beings, and he's finally convinced that, yes, he needs to get up and try to teach this. So he goes off to find 5 practitioners that he had trained with previously. They're disgusted because he got up and left at some point and said, this is not the answer, I still need to keep going. Somehow he goes back and finds them, teaches them the things that he learns. They decide, yes, he's onto something here. And these become his first Sangha members. These are his first students, right? So that's a very fast story about how do we get to 3 treasures, right? So now we have somebody who's under a tree and has experienced awakening. Now we have awakening. We have Buddha, right? We have what he experienced, what he now understood about the functioning of the universe. So we have Dharma. He's teaching this to others, right? We have Dharma. And we have at least these 5 original students. So now we have Sangha, right? Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. And these, of course, are the 3 treasures. So after his awakening, of course, Shakyamuni spends the rest of his life traveling around northern India, teaching people, practicing, giving talks, sitting, doing begging practice with his Sangha, which is growing and growing and growing, until he's about 80 years old. Of course, nothing he said at the time was written down. This is not the way these things were transmitted. Nobody was taking notes. Nobody was recording what the Buddha was saying. Would have been nice, but no. Instead, these things are memorized by his students. And when we start talking about sutras, one of the things we see is the teachings are full of lists. It is constant lists. He says something, and there's a list, and then there's a verse which recaps the thing. Why? Because everything was being memorized, right? So all the early teachings come from simply being memorized and repeated. So it was a long time, a good 100 years or more, before these things were written down. However, of course, that's the origin of what we now call the Pali Canon. Pali Canon is 3 baskets of teachings, right? So we have three pitakas, or 3 baskets. We have the Vinaya, which is the discipline. So this is rules, discipline of the Sangha. We've been talking about the Vinaya here a lot lately because we're talking about Nyoho and Nyoho-e, right? So the rules for how we make things, how we do things, conduct ourselves. There's the Sutta Pitaka, or Sutta or Sutra, which is the discourses, the sermons, the teachings of the Buddha. There's some poetry in there. It is the largest basket. So as Gene says, there are millions and millions and millions of words. The third one is the Abhidharma. So these are things that elaborate Buddhist doctrines, commentaries, particularly about the mind, or we might say about psychology, but we have to be a bit careful about that. It's the sort of systematic philosophy, right? So it's a little bit obscure, a little bit abstract. Okay, so now we also have the context for the Sanbuki, the 3 Buddha days. Those are 3 observances that we practice here will remember, right? So we have Buddha's birthday in April, we have his awakening in December, Rohatsu, and we have the Nirvana day when his physical body dies, right? So these 3 Buddha days are important days in our calendar. And you might remember, we've just now produced a new booklet through Dogen Institute with Toda-san's teachings about these 3 Buddha days. So we see we now have Buddha Dharma Sangha, we've got the 3 Buddha days, we start to see how things are being established around Buddha's life, right? So 3 treasures, Buddha Dharma Sangha. So in Soto Zen, and maybe not elsewhere in this tradition, we have 3 kinds of 3 treasures, and that is the chart on the back of your handout. You see manifesting, maintaining, absolute Buddha Dharma Sangha, right? So we find these in the Kyoju Kaimon that we hear during Ryakusatsu, or when we receive precepts, right? Dogen teaches about these 3 kinds of 3 treasures. So we know what the Buddha is, we know what Dharma is, we know what Sangha is. There's actually 3 ways to look at these things. So the manifesting 3 treasures, Ginzen Sanbo, these are the things that appeared in the world historically. These are the things I've just talked about in the life story of the Buddha. This is Shakyamuni as a human being who lived in India 2,600 years ago, we think. Architectural evidence and other things. After his awakening under this tree, he deeply understands the functioning of the universe, or the way reality works, including things like the Four Noble Truths, 12-fold chain of causation, which we'll talk about, those really basic fundamental things. He goes and finds people to share this with, and we call that teaching again the Dharma. Because what he was teaching was really just reality, right? Buddha always said, I didn't make this stuff up. This was here before I was here. I simply can see this now, right? This Dharma is not something I've created. It is actually the reality of the way the universe works. So Dharma is larger than just what Buddha said in the 76 million words, right? Dharma is everything we encounter. So sometimes this Dharma means universal functioning. So we have to be a little bit careful. Which way are we using Dharma? Are we using Dharma, this is something Buddha said, or are we using Dharma to indicate this is the way the universe functions? So although those things are not actually separate, we can make a distinction. So with Dharma, we need to just pay attention to that. And again, the people that the Buddha first taught became the first Sangha. So now we have the origin of the manifesting version of the 3 treasures, right? The 3 sort of historical elements. Then we've got the maintaining 3 treasures, Juji Sambo. So these are the 3 treasures that we still encounter today, right? Those first elements happened 2,600 years ago. They're long gone. Buddha's physical body is not here. The people he practiced with are not here, right? Whatever he said went out into the air. There was no recording. But there still is something called the maintaining 3 treasures. So today we still have, for instance, Buddha statues. Well, it's covered because we're doing Sesshin tomorrow, right? We have Buddha statues. We have paintings of Buddha. We have items that represent awakening to us, whatever that means. Some of you might have on your altars at home a stone or a feather or something. It might not be sort of an anthropomorphic representation of Buddha, but somehow we still encounter things that represent awakening to us or remind us to practice. So in early India, early Buddhism, there were no representations of the Buddha as a human being. Because it was said, well, awakening. I mean, how do you picture awakening, right? To picture the Buddha is beyond anything we can sort of make a statue of or draw a picture of. Awakening is bigger than that. However, Buddhism starts to move down the Silk Road, which we'll talk about in a minute. It encounters things like Greek aesthetics. Somehow a century or two later, we have Buddha statues. They look like Greek art, right? And then they start to look like the art of the other cultures that Buddhism encounters as it's going down the Silk Road. So these statues start to look like whatever that culture feels is a representation of something which is sacred, a representation of awakening. So we see a real variety. We start to see a real variety in the way the Buddha is represented. Nonetheless, that is a manifesting Buddha treasure. So sometimes we consider Dharma teachers in this role as the maintaining Buddha treasure, which is interesting, right? So Juji is a term that's sometimes used for the chief clergy in a temple, right? So there's this ongoing sort of association that somebody is holding that space. Somebody is representing awakening. Someone is representing Buddha, even on a day-to-day. So when I'm giving precepts, for instance, and I sit right there, so the preceptor always sits to the right and in front of the altar of the Buddha, right? You're sitting there in place of Buddha, holding that Buddha space. But, we can see anybody who's running a temple, and in some ways we can just see anybody who is making those life vows, as some of you have, right? To carry forward the lineage, to make those teachings available, to teach the Dharma and lead practice. We can see anybody in that kind of leadership role as holding that space for Buddha. Dogen kept calling his teacher Old Buddha. If you look at Dogen's writings, when he says, Old Buddha used to say, and we think, well, who is that? That's his teacher, which I think is kind of interesting, right? So these are all examples of maintaining Buddha treasure. If we think Buddha's dead and gone, we need to think again, right? Buddha's right here. Okay, when it comes to the Dharma, we have, of course, sutra books that record Buddha's teachings, things we use to chant from. We've also got many, many, many books of commentary and sutras and things we can watch online and podcasts we can listen to, right? Lots of maintaining Dharma treasure. So even if whatever it is a cheap copy, our sutra books are not fancy. Some of them are simply photocopies. Those things are relics of Buddha, at least in my mind. So we don't put them on the floor. We don't throw them around, right? We treat them carefully. That is the Dharma treasure, even though it's a simple piece of paper. We're still able to encounter the Dharma because these things are still available to us. So we treat that with a little bit of care, right? A little bit of respect. So finally, of course, we still have communities of people coming together to practice this crazy thing, to do Zazen, work, study, ritual for parts of our practice vision here. So some folks are here today. They're here in person. They're here virtually. Some have left the physical world, but because of their practice, it's possible for us to practice today. So all of our ancestors, all of our lineage, all the people who've practiced at Sanshin, helped to get it started, cleaned the zendo, cooked the meals, right? All of these people are, they've made it possible for us to practice. More folks will come after we're gone. So I hope 50 years from now, Sanshin is still here and people are still practicing. And the reason they're able to do that is that we here have taken care of the practice. We've held it. We've made it available to people. We've maintained the teachings. We've maintained it in body and mind, right? So that maintaining Sangha is not necessarily the people who are here with us in this room right now. It can be bigger than that. Okay. Of course, we also have, we can consider all beings throughout space and time. There's lots of teachings about sentient and insentient beings preaching the Dharma. So maybe our maintaining Sangha is not even all human beings. It can be animals and stones and rocks and mountains and rivers, right? Okay, maintaining Sangha treasure. Last but not least, we have the absolute three treasures, Ittai Sambo, literally one body, three treasures. So if we look at the manifesting three treasures, literally things before one's eyes, the three treasures that are literally before eyes. This is the same Gen as Genjo Koan for those who know Genjo koan. This is the same, again, something that manifests in front of our eyes. Maintaining three treasures, we have the sense of something that abides, an abiding three treasures. Now we're at absolute three treasures, Ittai Sambo, one body, three treasures. Now Todo-san talks about this quite a lot. So these are three aspects of one reality. These are not things we're going to necessarily touch and hold and carry around, right? Buddha isn't one person who attained awakening. In this case, Buddha is the act of awakening to the Dharma. It is awakening itself. It is not a concrete thing we grab, right? It's the act of awakening. So there is no separation really between Buddha and Dharma, no separation between a person and an action and a subject. There's no sort of person that's awakening to something. This is not something we can actually separate. So Buddha, Dharma, Sangha are already one thing. And if that's true, then the Sangha can't really become aware of awakening as an object out there or do something called waking up, right? There's no Sangha, which is waking up to something out there. There's only one thing happening here, right, from the view of the Absolute. This is what we call unsurpassable true awakening, Anuttara Samyak Sambodhi. So when we run across this in sutras, in the Heart Sutra in the morning, right, this is one body, three treasures, no separation. So provisionally we can say that the Absolute Buddha treasure is awakening, the Absolute Dharma treasure is reality, the Absolute Sangha treasure is interconnectedness or harmony. Sometimes we hear the virtue of peace and harmony is the absolute version of Sangha treasure. In this tradition we say we take refuge in the three treasures, right? There's a fascicle about that in the Shobogenzo. So we need a teacher like Buddha to show us the way. We can't yet see this reality for ourselves. We can see that there's a human being in front of us. We can't necessarily see the reality of awakening yet. We need a teacher to show us that. We need teachings or dharma if we're going to understand what suffering really is. What is the nature of suffering and delusion and all of this, right? We need teachings in order to help us see that, and also how to let go of that. Not only to understand the nature of suffering, but then how do we let go of suffering? How do we liberate ourselves and all beings? And we need others to practice with, for help, for support, to reinforce, encourage our practice. We're about to go into Sanshin, and this is where the rubber meets the road, man. This is where we really see. We need a community 100% wholeheartedly functioning together in order to support that very simple practice of sitting in front of a wall 14 periods a day, doing nothing but eating, sleeping, sitting, walking some kinhin, right? It's really interesting. You can ask Sawyer and to some degree Esho. They typically end up working on, let's make sure everything that gets done needs to get done. And that's a thing, right? Even for a simple thing like we're sitting facing the wall. Who's cooking the meals? Who's sweeping the floor? Who's lighting the candle? Who's ringing the bell, right? It's a very interesting, intensive experience of community, which is what Sanshin is. Okay. So we need to keep that support for carrying out Sanshin, Zazen work study ritual with others who have the same sort of aspiration, who are on this path with us, who have the same direction, right? So we all can support each other in that way. So I like to say to people, if you think it doesn't make any difference whether or not you show up in the Zendo, I beg to differ, right? Simply being present here is something. I used to hear that from teachers and I'd go, yeah, hearts and flowers. They just want me in the Zendo because they want people in the Zendo, right? So it was a long time before I really kind of got what that meant. It is much harder to show up. It is much harder, people at home may know this, if you're sitting alone, right? You're maintaining your own practice. It's a lot harder to get yourself up and onto a cushion when you're by yourself. It's a little bit easier when there's a group sitting together. You're all doing your own practice. It's like nobody can practice for you, but there's something about coming together as a community to sit, which makes things easier. So I don't care if it's your first time in the Zendo or you've been doing this for 50 years. Showing up makes a difference for you and for other people. Right? That is Bodhisattva activity. That is a very fast overview of Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. We have time at the end for questions and discussions, and we can come back, but is there any immediate small clarification that anybody wants to ask for it? Will, please.
I was just curious if this framework is something established or maybe something you came up with. No.
I didn't come up with this. So I think the first place that we encounter this, and the place that is probably most common, is the Kyoju Kaimon, which is Dogen's piece on teachings on conferring and receiving precepts. So if you come to the monthly Ryakusatsu, I read it out, or whoever is the doji reads it out. We actually hear it every month. If you receive precepts, we do that again, right? So I tend to look at this as an important teaching from Dogen. I'm sure if we dug into it, we might see where the roots of it are coming from, but I sort of lump this in with Dogen's teachings. So this is not a framework I wrote, and Toto-san has spent a lot of time talking about it. So we can go back from it. This is one of those cases where if you really want to dig into this, there's stuff out there. And I'm going to particularly say Toto-san has a book coming out about the precepts this year, and my guess is there's a lot there. So we might have to hold our breath for that one.
Well, I think there's an important distinction between Mahayana and
Yes,
Theravada.
please.
Because Theravada, by definition, is the doctrine of the elders, and really it's what Buddha said
Yeah.
that everybody traced. Mahayana came in about the first 100 years BC, or after,
CE.
whatever that is. and if you think about it, they're taking items from the Theravada doctrine and going, whoa, but let's understand what he said, not just what he said.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about it, because now all of a sudden it opens it up, because the Theravada would go, no.
So Theravadan teachings, and we have people with experience in Theravada and Vajrayana here, I'm guessing, so people can weigh in. And thank you for that lovely segue into the next part of today, which we're going to talk about the main branches of Buddhism and how it spreads. But just to sort of summarize, what Gene was talking about, yes, in the early teachings, we might say things are fairly literal, and the more we go along, they become slightly more interpreted, right? So as we look at the spread of Buddhism, we can see things will become more interpreted. So this is why I was saying earlier, it depends on what branch, what school, what sect, what denomination, what culture, what country, what time you're looking at something in, because things shift, right? Human beings shift, cultures shift, things move around geographically and in every other way. So if you look in Theravada teachings, which you come from, this is probably not something you encounter, right? In your early, in your Theravada practice, you probably didn't come across something like this.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard those three different lines
Yeah.
of meaning, in general, but when we're talking about Theravada, it's very literal,
Yes.
historical meanings.
Right. So I hope people who have experience in various traditions will weigh in over the next 6 weeks, right? Help us put things in context and understand. So please don't be shy as we go on. Other quick things about three treasures, which we could spend the next 6 weeks talking on alone. But as long as everyone feels like if you wanted to go on with this, you would have some basis to do some reading, do some thinking, practicing, writing. Okay. Thanks. All right. So let's move to the main branches of Buddhism, how Buddhism moves around. So again, you have a map on the back of your handout. You can just use for your reference to get some sense of how things moved, where they moved, why things look the way they look. So in North America today, we have, for the first time in the history of Buddhism, access to pretty much every kind of Buddhism there is, because we can go online. We can go to the library. We can read about any kind of, any shape, any color, any whatever of Buddhism. Traditionally, that's not the way things were. You kind of practiced what was in your geographic area, right? Things didn't move that quickly. There wasn't electronic communication. Things got blocked by mountains and by water, and so it took a long time for these things to move around. So I usually like to caution people. Today, we can read anything by anybody at any time. Certainly, read around, educate yourself, get a fresh perspective. There's nobody here that's going to say what we do is the one true way, and you should never look outside of that. However, please know the source of what you're looking at, right? If you're reading along thinking you're reading about Soto Zen, and you're actually reading about Theravadan practice or Vajrayana practice, and you're going, why doesn't this line up, right? It's important to know what's the source of what you're looking at. Not only is the author credible, and that's a whole other thing. You do want to make sure you're reading something credible and sort of competent. But if you're confused by what's being said, just know things get interpreted. So are you reading something from Soto Zen, from Rinzai Zen, from Chan, from Theravadan practice, Shingon practice, Keigon practice, something else? Okay? Okay, so after Buddha's death, of course, the Sangha keeps practicing, studying. Over time, Buddhism starts to spread, in large part along the Silk Road, along the road on the map that you have. Now, when I used to teach this at the college level, I used to make sure we understood the difference between an ethnic religion and a universal religion, right? So an ethnic religion tends to stay put. It might go with, somebody might leave that country, leave that city, and go somewhere else and continue their practice, but it's not like the practice itself is spreading. Hinduism is an example of that, I think, right? Your family might go somewhere and practice because that's where they are, but we can't look around and say, well, there's this sort of vast spreading of Hinduism, right? Buddhism is not like that. So we could say Buddhism, amongst other religious traditions, is universal in that it spreads on its own, right? So it's an interesting wrinkle in how our practice develops. So transmission happens from the 1st century all the way through the 7th century along the Silk Road. That is a long time. It covers a lot of ground. This practice encounters a number of different cultures along that way. But imagine all those hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years it's taking to move down the Silk Road. So there are 3 main groups involved in carrying this practice. They're sometimes characterized as missionaries, merchants, and monks. I like the alliteration. Sawyer will laugh at me. He knows I like a good alliterative phrase. Missionaries, merchants, and monks. This is who's carrying the practice. So there are actual missionaries being sent out, often by kings or princes, to spread the Dharma, spread the teachings. Merchants are probably practicing themselves. They are taking their practice along the Silk Road as they're doing their business. And they are the ones who are going to start establishing maybe places for people to stop and sleep, rest places, places to get food. What's going to happen? People are going to congregate in those places, and they're going to start talking about teachings, practice, right? And then you have, the actual monks, right? You've got some Dharma leaders. And now we have temples. So what happens when we have temples and people coming and going and places to sleep and places to eat and trade happening? We start to have communities, right? We start to have sort of civic centers. And so this is how this develops as it goes along the road. So we have missionaries, merchants, and monks. It's not just a case of people in robes sort of walking around and converting people. It's very much there's very much a social element to this thing. So some practitioners, again, some travelers, simply practitioners carrying their practice with them, doing their practice as they travel. Some are supporting these guest houses, supporting these temples that start to spring up. We have trading centers, communities. So what's being traded here, what's being exchanged here is not only things like incense and cloth and oil and goods, right? There's a dana system that starts to develop here, right? You've got monks and teachers who are giving teachings, and you have people like merchants with money, with material support, who are giving to support the monks and the temples. And so now we start to see again this development of dana. We know dana, generosity, giving, is an important practice here. It starts, it doesn't start there because it starts with Buddha, but it continues as we go down the Silk Road. Okay. So we've got this practice moving from India, following your map, all around. There's a northern route and a southern route, and some are traveling over land, and there's some going by water, but we start to see it moving in the direction of China. Practice gets to China, and the Chinese start to say, what has happened to the practice over the course of that travel? We need to go back to the beginning and sort of reconnect with the original teachings. Now you've got monks going back the other way. So now it's not just a one-way transmission. Now we have two-way transmission. We've got people going back to get texts, to work on translations, to get to the roots of their practice, to go on pilgrimage. Now it gets even more complicated. This whole Silk Road transmission is an incredibly complicated thing. You could spend your life studying it. It's super interesting. Right? So now we've got this two-way thing happening. And that goes on, as I say, we could spend 6 weeks on that. Basically, the Silk Road transmission ends with the rise of Islam. in Central Asia in the 7th century. Now that starts to rise up and it captures people's attention, and then we have some conflict, right, about the spread of religion and who's practicing what. So during this time we have not only economic development, we have the spread of practice, we have cultural exchange, we have things like Buddhist art being influenced by all of those cultural exchange, artifacts, what do the artifacts look like? All of these cultures are weighing in. So we have things that look very Central Asian, things that look Greek, right? There are encounters with multiple religious traditions, languages. When we get to sutras, we can spend some time talking about the whole translation thing, which was enormous. The way something gets translated sometimes actually change the content of the teachings. So when we're saying, why do we practice like this? Why have we adopted certain teachings? There's a whole big translation piece which is really important. Okay, so we see Buddhism has split into 3 sort of main bodies, main groups. 2 of those happen in India, 2 of them emerge in India, and the third one happens more in China, Tibet. So we have what we sometimes call the 3 turnings of the wheel. So the first turning sometimes we'll call Theravadan. Sometimes you will see Theravadan practice labeled as Hinayana. Please don't use that term. Not politically correct. It means the lesser vehicle, right? So of course early on it was a way to say, oh, those people, they don't know as much as the Mahayana folks do. So we don't call it Hinayana. Theravadan, please, is the early teachings. The second turning is the Mahayana, the greater vehicle, or the great vehicle. Mahayana includes Zen. So that's where we locate ourselves in this group of things. The third turning is the Vajrayana, which is again mainly Tibet, Nepal, Mongolia. There is a Japanese version of that called Shingon, which also affects our practice, which we can talk about. So we have influences in Zen really from all 3 kinds of practice. Is that a hand up?
I'm sorry.
Did you have your hand up?
No.
Okay. So again, I'm going very quickly through this, but just so that we're introduced to it. So Theravadan, as Jean has pointed out, the way of the elders, literally the way of the elders. So this includes both monks and laity, but the monks were really the ones that were doing the practice. The laity didn't have a lot of voice in establishing Buddhism as an institution. What you did as a layperson was contribute to the monks, so the monks could do the practice, and if you were lucky, maybe you were reborn in the next life as a monk to do the practice and liberate yourself. So beginning in the 1st century BCE, Buddha's teachings start to be written down. This is where the sutras start to become developed. In general, this is a fairly conservative, right, monastic Buddhism. It sticks pretty closely, as we were saying, to the literal interpretations of teaching. This is the first turning of the wheel. So this is when Buddha taught the Four Noble Truths, for instance, the really early, most foundational teachings. Of course, these first teachings don't mention the other 2 turnings of the wheel because they haven't happened yet, right? So you won't see references to 3 turnings of the wheel in the most early teachings. Second one, Mahayana, or the great vehicle. This is the second turning again. Buddha teaches some additional things. The way this is characterized is, Buddha, yes, Theravadan practice is there, teachings are there. Buddha teaches some additional things. We have additional sutras starting to be written down 1st century CE. So this is after Buddha's not physically here, but somehow we have continuing development of scriptures. So there is both monastic and lay practice, and this is where lay people start to have a stronger voice in the development of sort of Buddhism as an institution. There are lots of stories you can go find and track down about how lay people were entrusted with Buddha's relics, for instance, why we have stupas in various places. The lay people were the ones sort of maintaining the stupas as places of pilgrimage so that monks could be doing monk practice, right? So there's a partnership. There's an interesting way how the lay practice is developing. So for instance, we know when we take precepts here, if you're ordaining as a novice or if you're taking lay precepts, those 16 precepts are the same precepts, right? Monk practice and lay practice becomes intertwined. So in response to the increasing development of lay practice, now we have new deities, we have new rituals, new practices. People sort of choose their own path from diverse sets of options. So in the Theravadan, you pretty much had one path. You were going to ordain, you were going to be a monk, or you were going to be a nun, and this was your path. When we get to the Mahayana, we start to see some opening of different ways to practice, different paths, right? Different understanding, particularly during that Silk Road transmission. That is a very fast look at the Mahayana. Again, you could spend your life. Third turning of the wheel, the Vajrayana, is the lightning vehicle or the diamond vehicle, depending on how you translate that. So it was said that this third turning confirmed the first two. So it's not negating these. Each turning doesn't negate the one before. It expands on it. It develops it, right? There's some additional stuff. So again, it confirms the first two teachings. It adds some more things. So this is a further development of the Mahayana. The Vajrayana and the Mahayana are not separate. They are intertwined in some interesting kinds of ways. So new texts continue to appear all the way up until the 12th century. Again, of course, these were not things that supposedly the Buddha said, right? These were commentaries and teachings from the people who come after him. This is a more esoteric kind of tradition. Again, we mainly associate it with Tibet, but it has roots in other places, right? There is a Japanese version of this. So one main difference between these three branches, if we want to sort of, how do I distinguish between these three? One way we can come at that is to ask ourselves, what is the ideal practitioner in each of these three schools? So in order to understand what the ideal practitioner is, we have to talk about three more basic elements. We have to talk about samsara, nirvana, and rebirth. Now, we're going to go through those in much more detail in weeks 3 and 4, but I at least need to mention them here because they have some bearing on how we understand what is an ideal practitioner. So samsara, of course, is the world of delusion. This is where we're caught up in suffering of the Four Noble Truths. Mainly this world right here, in this karmic human form. This is samsara, right? There are said to be 6 realms to this world of samsara. So we have, again, the gods, the powerful giants, the humans, the animals, the hungry ghosts, and the hell realms. Lots and lots of hell realms. We'll talk about this more later on. The beings in all of these realms have suffering, even the gods, even the fighting giants. But the human realm is the only place where we can actually practice and liberate ourselves. So we hear things like, you've received the pivotal opportunity of human form. Do not pass your days and nights in vain, right? So in this human form, this is where we can practice. So we can have some gratitude for being born in this human realm in samsara. Nirvana is where the fires of delusion and suffering have gone out. So we're no longer creating the conditions for rebirth. Rebirth is a big topic, which we can talk about again later on. But we're no longer creating the conditions that keep us tied to this round and round and round of suffering. So the key is that we deeply understand that there is no independent, permanent self-nature. This is where we started to go when we were talking about structure of the self, right? There is no independent, fixed self-nature. So nirvana is supposed to be a joyful place. We have no stress, everything is peaceful, full of all the good virtues, right? It's a very nice place to be, some place we'd like to get to. In our tradition, of course, samsara and nirvana are not two separate places. We can have all those experiences of a very nice place to be, liberated from suffering, right here in this place, in this body and mind. So supposedly, this nirvana is where we go when we leap free of this wheel of birth and death and continuing to create suffering for ourselves, right? Okay. So early Buddhism inherited this teaching, or this concept of rebirth or reincarnation, from the Hindu container in which it arose. So just like Jesus came up in a Jewish container, Buddha came up in a Hindu or Vedic container, right? So he's influenced by all those things. So the events of this life, under this teaching, the events of this life condition what happens in the next life. So until we free ourselves from delusion, ignorance, craving, hindrance, right? Until we free ourselves from that, we're going to keep creating these conditions for rebirth in a world of suffering over and over and over and over. So Buddha knew in his lifetime that that was his last rebirth. He knew he was now ready to leap off the wheel because he had had this awakening experience. He stopped creating those karmic conditions, right? He had to live out his life, his physical life as a human being, but he knew because of his awakening experience, he was not going to have to do it again, right? So with those three things, samsara, nirvana, and rebirth, now we can talk about the ideal practitioner. So Theravadan practice has arhats, right? The arhat is someone who practices and attains awakening and jumps off this wheel of birth and death, lands in nirvana as a Buddha, and never returns to the world of samsara. So the goal is, I'm going to practice, I'm going to wake up, I'm going to leap off the wheel, I'm going to get out of here, I'm going to live in nirvana forever as a Buddha, and I'm not coming back. So this is typically a monastic practice, right? Why? Because if you're in that container, you can simply concentrate on sitting or chanting or whatever your practice is, free from the responsibilities you would have if you were raising a family, running a business, right, living in the world. So that monastic container is really important. If that's your practice and you're focused on, I need to wake up so I can leap free of this wheel, this is all you're doing. So the arhat. Mahayana has the bodhisattva. We've all heard of the bodhisattva, right? Someone who practices and wakes up and remains in samsara to teach the Dharma and to liberate beings from suffering and to help people cross over, right? So this is not a case of I'm leaping free of the wheel, I'm landing in nirvana, I'm never coming back. This is a case of I've had my awakening experience, I understand how things work, and I'm staying here to help other beings. So arhats are typically monastic. Bodhisattvas can be lay people, right? So now we see how Mahayana is developing, right? Bodhisattvas can be lay people in the world carrying out responsibilities because that's not separate from the practice of liberating beings. So Theravadan schools say that the Buddha's instruction was given so that you can become an arhat and reach nirvana. The Mahayana tradition says, yes, that happened, and that was Buddha using skillful means, right? Offering this attractive goal, nirvana, this wonderful, peaceful, happy, joyful place, in order to lead people away from the kind of delusion and unwholesome behavior and harmful stuff that we just engage in because of our greed, anger, and ignorance, right? So yes, he says, become an arhat so that later on I can point you toward becoming a bodhisattva. So we see why there's a little bit of like, yeah, our practice is better than yours, right? This feeling. So become an arhat, that's great. But then go on and become a bodhisattva. So Manjushri, Avalokiteshvara, Kshitigarbha are all well-known bodhisattvas. So Manjushri is up here. Kanon or Avalokiteshvara we have out in the garden. We have a shrine. We don't have a Jizo here. Jizo is also quite a well-known bodhisattva, right? So there are traditional sort of embodiments of those qualities. Those are well known. But we also think of really all of us human practitioners as bodhisattvas. We're all out in the world carrying our practice, liberating beings. And it can be as simple as someone's hands are full and you open the door, right? It doesn't have to be it's a big flash of lightning and someone has an awakening experience. It's simply moving through the world in a way which is wholesome and compassionate and wise and not creating suffering for ourselves and others, right? So we're not practicing for our own gain only, we're practicing for the benefit of all beings. So this split, Theravadan and Mahayana, sort of signals the end of the first era of Buddhism. Now it starts to expand in new countries, becomes even more diverse. So syncretism, well, we'll get to syncretism in a minute. So third one, Vajrayana tradition. There's a third turning of the wheel, which happens supposedly 16 years after the Buddha's awakening. So the first tantric texts start to appear in the 3rd century CE, and as I say, they continue on until the 12th. So syncretism is key as Buddhism moves through new cultures, new countries along this map. On the Silk Road, Mahayana encounters things like Zoroastrianism and Judaism and Christianity and Islam and cultures and languages, Greeks, Iranians, Central Asians, right? This is where the Buddha statues come from. So the kings and the merchants who built these temples along the Silk Road, again, provided a place for travelers to meet, to exchange ideas. Translation starts to happen. Studies start to happen. As we go along then, Buddhism goes through Central Asia, it gets to China. Now it encounters Taoism, and it encounters Confucianism, and it takes on some of those particular elements. So from Taoism, we get things like living in harmony with nature, right? Effortless action, ways of understanding duality, non-duality. Maybe some folks have some experience with those kinds of practices, right? Going beyond sort of intellectual understanding, right? We get all those things from Taoism. Early text translations from that were going into Chinese developed there before coming to Japan. So then we see things like koans, development of koans, develop these non-intellectual situations. We want to think they're paradoxes, right? Dogen would say it's not either or, it's yes and, right? We see a paradox. Those are not intellectual puzzles to solve. That's about direct experience, right? Again, we can point back to some of the influence of Taoism from that. From Confucianism, this is where we get a lot of our precepts, ethics, right? Social values, moral conduct, right action. Teacher-student relationships are in some ways quite Confucian, right? If we understand how Confucianism works. Things like Dharma transmission, right? Emphasis on we have to do our own practice, self-cultivation, right effort, diligent effort, right? A lot of influence there from Confucianism. So when we get to Japan, then we add Shinto. So Shinto reinforces this respect for nature. It's very much about that. Respect for ancestors, things like filial piety, things like purity, right? So we see all of these influences all starting to pile onto this practice or attach themselves to this practice. So today, Buddhism and Shinto, in Japan, often it's hard to see the difference. And maybe at some point, Esho has some stories to tell. These things are often blended. You'll see a shrine on temple grounds, a Shinto shrine on temple grounds. We don't know which one came first, right? In that culture, for instance, you're probably going to get married in a Shinto ceremony, but buried in a Buddhist funeral. So there's a lot of mixing, right? There's no real line. So when Vajrayana, by the way, shows up in Japan, it becomes Shingon Buddhism. So if you're interested in that kind of Buddhist practice and you want to see what is a closer relationship to Zen, look up Shingon practice. Shingon has a real influence on Zen. I just learned the other day, and I was not aware of this, much of the early Baika canon, we've got two Baika people here, right? I'll throw this out to you. Much of the early Baika canon actually comes from Shingon, which is kind of interesting. Keizan Zenji, one of our most important ancestors, was also really heavily influenced by Shingon. He's one of those more esoteric guys, right? When we get to One Buddha, Two Founders, he's one of our two founders. Strongly influenced by Shingon. Much of our ritual practice originates with him, or we can trace it to him. So much of our ritual that we even do today has this direct through line to Shingon. So this is why it's important to have this context and know it's not like there's this straight line that says here's Dogen and there's everything came straight from Dogen and that's all there is. It's a huge Soto Zen world, right? Everything's got its fingers and everything else. So that is kind of the point I think I want to leave you with for today, is that there isn't this sort of straight line from Shakyamuni Buddha and everything was transmitted absolutely perfectly and nothing ever got changed. Nothing ever got influenced, right? It's a huge story. There are a lot of interesting byways. I think for us in North America, it's particularly important because sometimes we look at the various cultural influences and we think, that doesn't apply to me. Oh, this Japanese stuff. Oh, this Chinese stuff. Oh, this early, Central Asian stuff. Oh, that doesn't apply to me. I just want the sort of universal, crystallized Buddha teachings separate from culture. And I often make the argument, how are you going to separate that from culture? Because if you're going to drop all those things we sometimes call cultural trappings, what are you going to do? You're going to drop that down into North American culture and attach North American culture to it. So how is that ever going to work, right? So I just think it's useful to sort of understand how that development happens. We can't always assume we know why things are the way they are. We kind of want to look at Dogen and go, that's our guy, and everything we do today must be what Dogen did. Well, we know. We're not sure that Dogen ever did Kinhin, for instance. If he did, we don't know what it looked like. There were reform movements, right? Things change. So I think it's really important for us as North Americans, without the cultural history, to have some clue, right, about where things come from. We'd like to say everything came directly from Buddha or everything came directly from Dogen. I don't think we can actually say that. And I think that doesn't invalidate the elements of our practice that we carry out, that we learn from our teachers, that we enjoy doing together, right? Okay, maybe Keizan had some Shingon influence. That doesn't mean that our Zen, quote unquote, Zen liturgy needs to change, or that we've got things we need to drop, right? It's a complicated thing. So for me, as I say, how did we get here is a really important question. So I'm kind of, I'm being a little bit self-indulgent when I bring that to you, because that's kind of always been a big question for me. And I'll just preview here that in 2026, as a theme for our practice, I'm probably going to take something I'm calling the world of Soto Zen. because I think we need to dig into where did the elements come from? Why does it look like this? And then how does that happen in North America in a way which is reasonable and sustainable and relevant? I would make the argument there's none of it that isn't relevant, right? But if we have that larger context, then I think we become secure in our own foundation, in our practice.